Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the Civil War, and the information that we'll be talking about today is very important for your final exam. Now, the most important thing to understand about the Civil War going into it is that it's an independence movement, just like the American Revolution. The Southern states tried to break away and form their own nation, just like the colonists during the American Revolution. The reason we call it a civil war, which means an internal war, is because the South lost. Had the South won, we would call it a war of Southern independence. There are a lot of similarities to the American Revolution, and so it's important to understand how and why these two wars turned out so differently. So the first thing we're going to be talking about are a little background, and then we'll be talking about the advantages and disadvantages going into the fighting. So just to remind you, after Lincoln was elected in 1860, the 7 states of the Deep South, they all seceded from the Union before he could even be inaugurated. When Lincoln was inaugurated March 20th, he called on the states to send soldiers to raise an army to bring the South back into the Union. When he did that, 4 more states immediately seceded: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. The other 4 slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, they'll all stay with the Union for all different reasons. So now the country is completely divided between ones that stayed with the Union and ones that joined the Confederacy. In terms of the advantages, from the outset, it looked like the North had all the advantages, and so they were going to win, just like the British during the American Revolution. First and foremost, they had a much larger population. The North's white population was about 22 million. In contrast, the South had about 9 million people, but 3.5 million of those were slaves. So their white population was only about 5.5 million. So the North had overwhelmingly more people. The North also had all the manufacturing or industry. 90% of manufacturing was in the North, and the North had all the advanced manufacturing, like making cannons and making rifles, making guns, the kind of stuff you need to win a war. The South only had 10%, and their manufacturing was not advanced. It was almost exclusively textiles or cotton manufacturing. The North also had the majority of transportation, most importantly, railroads. And this will be very important to getting supplies and men to Union forces. The North also had all the banks. Southerners didn't like banks, they didn't trust them. And so the North had all the banks, so they had control of the money. The North also had a strong, stable central government. The South, in contrast, had a really weak government. The Articles of Confederation created a really weak central government, which left all the powers to the states. It was just like the government created by the colonists during the American Revolution under the Articles of Confederation. Both the Articles of Confederation and the Confederate States of America are confederate governments, which means they have very little power in the central government. So the central government can't raise taxes, and all the power is left to the states. The North had better equipped soldiers, and the North also had the entire Navy. So Lincoln was able to call for a blockade of the entire South, and throughout the entire war, the South will have a naval blockade. So it'll be very difficult to get weapons, supplies, and ships in and out. So the North seems to have all the advantages, but the South had some very important advantages that in some ways will give it the upper hand. For one, the South was pretty much unified. There was nearly universal support and universal commitment by white Southerners to the Confederate cause. The North was really divided. There were a lot of people from the very beginning that didn't support the Civil War, didn't support the North, and wanted to just let the South go, especially Northern Democrats. So the South is solidly controlled by Democrats, but there were some Democrats in the North, and they really opposed the war. They're called Peace Democrats or Copperheads. They tried, from the very beginning, they tried to undermine the Union and Abraham Lincoln. And they tried to push for a peace settlement, which would mean the South wins and gets to be its own nation. So the division in the North was, that was very dangerous for the North, just like the British were divided during the American Revolution. Another advantage the South has is military leadership. The military leaders in the South were just better. They produced a lot of really great generals like Stonewall Jackson, and most importantly, Robert E. Lee, arguably the greatest general in US history. Lee he wasn't an ardent defender of slavery, and he did not support secession. But when it came down to it, he could not fight for the Union because he could not turn against his home state of Virginia. So he joined the Confederacy out of loyalty to Virginia. And more than anyone else, he will be responsible for the South succeeding for 4 years. Without him, had he joined the North, then the war would have been over much, much sooner. He only loses 2 battles the entire war. In contrast, the North will have some good generals, but 3 of the most famous generals the North will produce weren't even in the military when the Civil War started. Those are George B. McClellan, Ulysses S. Grant, and William Tecumseh Sherman. The most famous of them being Grant. He had been in the military, but he had actually resigned because he was going to be court-martialed for drunkenness. He was actually working at his father's dry goods store when the Civil War broke out. So in terms of military leadership, the South just had better leaders. In terms of political leadership, it also looked like the South had a better leader. So the president of this Confederacy will be Jefferson Davis. He's the one and only president of the Confederate States of America. And he had a very impressive background. He's from a very rich family of planters. He went to West Point. He was a hero of the Mexican-American War, served as Secretary of War, had been in the House of Representatives, and had been in the US Senate. So he had a very impressive both military and political background. Abraham Lincoln had a surprisingly unimpressive background. It was impressive for the fact that he was born really poor and he rose up to be a very successful lawyer. So it was impressive from where he came from, but compared to Davis, it was not impressive at all. In terms of his military experience, he had served in the Illinois state militia for a time, but never sought any combat at all. In terms of political experience, he served 8 years in the Illinois House of Representatives, and his only experience at the national level was 2 years in the US House of Representatives. And that is all of his experience. So it looked like the South had better political leadership. That will turn out not to be the case, but that's what a lot of people thought. But the most important advantage the South had, the single most important advantage, was their military objective. As I mentioned before, and as I mentioned in the American Revolution lecture, the North is fighting what's called a counterinsurgency. They're trying to put down an internal rebellion. This means they have to do 2 things. First, the North has to find and conquer this main Southern army. That's the Army of Northern Virginia, headed by Robert E. Lee. So first they have to find the Army of Northern Virginia and conquer it. That is doable. It'll take them 4 years to do it. And Lee will make it very difficult, but that one is tangible. That one is easier to accomplish than the second one. Second thing they have to do is they have to conquer the South, occupy the South, and convince all Southerners not to rebel. And that is really, really difficult. That is the hardest part of a counterinsurgency, is trying to convince the population to stop rebelling. And there's two ways to do this. One, you win their hearts and minds. You make them want to stop rebelling. Or two, you completely destroy their will to resist by really aggressive, really heavy-handed tactics. So this is what the British had to do in the American Revolution, and it's just a very, very difficult task. In contrast, what the South has to do in order to win is much easier. They don't have to invade the North. They don't have to defeat the main Northern Army. All they have to do is convince Northerners it's not worth their time and effort to keep fighting and just to let the South go. So all the South has to do, all Robert E. Lee has to do, is fight a prolonged war of attrition and exhaustion. Drag it out for as long as they possibly can, till Northerners get so sick of it and so sick of the high taxes and the high expenses, and just say, let the South go. That is exactly what happened during the American Revolution. So the South's objective was just much easier. And there's a long history of really powerful nations with bigger populations, better weapons, better technology, and more money being defeated by a much weaker, much smaller country in a counterinsurgency. The American Revolution, the Vietnam War, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and more recently, the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. All of those are counterinsurgencies in which the major power was defeated. So the question is, how did the North win this then? If we have so many examples of counterinsurgencies being lost by the major power, how did the North manage to win? And this is where we get to see Abraham Lincoln's true genius. From the very beginning, Lincoln had one objective: preservation of the Union. And he would do absolutely anything to accomplish that. And so this meant two things. He understood what the South was trying to do and what the North had to do in order to win. So he did two things to make sure the North won. First, he demanded a really fast, really aggressive military campaign by the North. He understood Southerners just needed to drag out the war as long as possible. So he insisted his generals fight really fast and really aggressively. That's why he will go through 8 generals throughout the course of the war. When a general wouldn't act fast enough or be aggressive enough, he would replace them. So he did that 8 times. Most famous was George McClellan. McClellan was a great general, great at organizing armies, great at equipping them and training them, but he always had excuses not to use them. So Lincoln will hire and fire McClellan twice because McClellan just would not be aggressive enough. And that's why in 1864, Lincoln will eventually settle on Ulysses S. Grant. Grant will also understand the point of the war. And so he is incredibly aggressive as a general, and he'll throw Union forces against Lee and against the Southern Army over and over and over again, almost recklessly. During the war, Grant got the nickname the Butcher. And he was not called the Butcher because of how many Confederates he killed. He was called the Butcher because of how many of his own men he sent to their deaths. He got that nickname because of the Battle of Cold Harbor. He sent his men on to attack a completely fortified, defended position, and he lost 7,000 men in 20 minutes. Now, that sounds like he was just a bad general and he did a bad job, but he didn't. He did a really good job. And the reason I say that is because this is what had to be done in order for the North to win. It was not pretty, but nothing about the Civil War was pretty. And his right-hand man in accomplishing his objective is William Tecumseh Sherman. And Sherman also will understand the objective, and he will bring the war to the civilian population and make the civilian population really feel the effects of it so they won't support the rebellion anymore. So that is the first thing that Lincoln did, is he made sure the North launched a really aggressive war so the South couldn't drag it out for a long time. The second thing he did is make sure the South did not get diplomatic help. In all of the other examples I gave, the weaker country that won in a counterinsurgency, they had assistance from a foreign nation. In the American Revolution, it was the French that helped colonists. During the Vietnam War, China and the Soviet Union helped North Vietnam. In the war in Afghanistan, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the United States armed the Afghani population. Well, it was actually the Taliban the United States armed to fight against the Soviets. But it was absolutely essential for the South to get assistance from a foreign country because they didn't have money, they didn't have manufacturing, so they would have to bring it all in. And England and France wanted the South to be independent. It would be better for England and France economically. And so Lincoln made sure that didn't happen. And the way he did that was after the Battle of Antietam. Now, you're only going to have to know a couple battles, and the Battle of Antietam is one of the most important. By 1862, England looked like it was going to step in and try to mediate a truce between the North and the South that would make the South into an independent nation. In order to try to get foreign assistance, Southerners realized they needed to have a victory. So Lee decided he was going to invade the North. So Lee invaded the North, and it led to a battle at a place called at Antietam. And in the end, Antietam ended up being inconclusive, meaning there was no clear-cut winner or loser on either side. But Lee had failed to win. And so Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia had to return to the South. So they didn't lose, but they didn't win, which means Lee failed at his objective. The Battle of Antietam is really important because it's the diplomatic turning point of the American Revolution. Just like Saratoga, it's a diplomatic turning point of the Civil War, just like Saratoga was in the American Revolution. After this, England will not give assistance, England and France will not give assistance to the South for two reasons. First, the Confederate Army was not able to invade the North and win in battle. Because had they done that, they could show they had a chance of winning. But second, and more importantly, after Antietam, Lincoln took this as the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So he had been fighting the Civil War to preserve the Union, but with the Emancipation Proclamation, he elevated the Civil War to be about a higher cause, slavery. And when he made the Civil War about slavery, England and France could not assist the South anymore. They had gotten rid of slavery a long time ago. They had been responsible for the end of the international slave trade, and they were really anti-slavery. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation and made the Civil War about slavery, that killed any chance of the South getting any assistance from England and France. And without foreign assistance, the South just could not win. So Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of people think this is what freed the slaves. It is not what freed the slaves. The 13th Amendment is what freed the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation, it said slaves would be slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people well whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free. So Lincoln freed the slaves only in the rebelling states. There were 4 slave states that stayed with the Union, and he did not free those slaves. This shows you freeing the slaves was not his ultimate objective. Preserving the Union was. What he was actually hoping was the southern states would read this and decide to rejoin the Union. Since if they joined the Union, they could have kept their slaves. None of them did, but I promise you, had they rejoined the Union after Lincoln issued this, he would have let them keep their slaves, because his most important objective, or I should say his objective first and foremost, was preservation of the Union. When no southern state did, though, this committed the North to freeing the slaves once the war was over. After the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, one of the other most important battles of the Civil War was the Siege of Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg. Vicksburg was a city on the Mississippi River, and it was the last city controlled by the Confederacy. If Union forces took over Vicksburg, that means the Union would control the entire Mississippi River, and it would be able to split the Confederacy in half. So Union forces led by Grant surrounded Vicksburg and laid siege to it. In order to try to draw Grant away from Vicksburg, Robert E. Lee decided he was going to invade the North again. So Robert E. Lee invaded the North to try to persuade Grant to pull his soldiers away to come chase Lee. Lee invaded the North, and it led to a battle at a place called Gettysburg. This is one of the most important battles of the entire Civil War. And unlike Antietam, Lee lost completely. It happened over a few days, but Lee and the Confederate Army, they lost completely and totally and were forced to retreat back to the South. He lost about 1/3 of his entire army at Gettysburg. The same time that he had to retreat back to the South, having just lost, Vicksburg fell to Ulysses S. Grant and the Union forces there. With these 2 defeats, Vicksburg and Gettysburg, this marked the beginning of the end for the South. After this, it is just, it is downhill for the South, and they never fully recover from these losses, especially because the year after this, in 1864, Lincoln, having gone through 7 other generals, he finally made Grant head of the military for the North. And Grant did exactly what Lincoln wanted him to do. He fought a really aggressive war and just attacked Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia over and over and over again. Lee was a much better general, and so Grant would send Union forces after Lee, and Lee would defeat Grant in battle, and he would kill more Union soldiers and force the Union to Grant's men to retreat. But the problem for Lee was, if Grant lost thousands of men, he could just get reinforcements. He loses 7,000 men and he would just say, send me more men. And the North was so much bigger, they could just keep sending more men. The South did not have that. So every person Lee lost, he could not replace him. So Grant will just doggedly pursue Lee and attack him over and over and over again, and just wear him out and wear his army out and wear his soldiers out until he just whittles Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia down to almost nothing. So Lee will win most of the battles, but he is losing the war every time he loses men. While Grant was pursuing Lee and fighting him over and over and over again, Sherman brought the war to the Southern population. It's called Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Sherman went down and took the city of Atlanta, one of the most important cities in the entire South. And then when he was finished with that, he launched a campaign to punish the South. And so he marched from Atlanta to the city of Savannah on the coast of Georgia, and he destroyed everything in his path. And he had his men live off the land, so they would take all the food, all the crops they needed from the population. And the whole thing was very brutal and very ugly. They didn't rape and murder like people in Georgia say. That didn't happen. But they destroyed property, and they freed 40,000 slaves in the process. In Georgia alone, he did about $100 million in damage, in property damage, which today is about $1.5 billion. And then when he was done in Georgia, he went up to South Carolina and he destroyed about a dozen cities. Now, this sounds horrible, and this is really horrible. But remember, in order for the North to win, in order for the North to keep the United States together, they had to convince the entire Southern population to not rebel. And so when Sherman did this, he sent the message to the rest of the South: if you try to resist, this is what will happen to you. So this is all very ugly and horrible. But remember, Sherman and Grant are just doing what Lincoln wanted them to do. And the reason Lincoln wanted them to do this isn't because he hated Southerners. It's because he understood the North would lose if this dragged on too long. So the South was devastated, and Lee's army was gradually worn down until by the time we get to early 1865, it was obvious the Confederacy was going to lose. Lee's army was just battered. His men were hungry. Some didn't have shoes. Some hadn't eaten in days. And he decided to make his last stand in April of 1865 at a place called Appomattox. Just to give you an idea of how hopeless Lee's situation was by this time, he only had 28,000 men left. In contrast, Grant had 150,000 men. So the numbers alone show you 28,000 men who were hungry, who were tired, without any replacements coming, versus 150,000 fresh soldiers who were well fed and well prepared for battle. Didn't take long for Lee to realize the situation was hopeless. So Lee asked for the terms of surrender. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. And when he did that, that effectively meant the end of the Civil War. Jefferson Davis will try to keep it going for a little longer, but he will be captured by the Union Army in less than a month after Appomattox. marking the end of the Civil War. Hope everyone is doing well. Hope everyone is staying safe and everyone is healthy. Please let me know if you have any questions.